Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to Circle's second in the webinar series on integrating social justice in the language classroom. My name is Chantel Warner, and together with my colleague Beatrice Dupuis, I'm the co-director of Circle, the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy, and we're the host of this event. We also have here with us today Kate Mackay, our Associate Director, and Xochitl Coronado Vargas, our Outreach Coordinator, and they've both been working really hard on organizing this and the other webinar series that we have planned for you this semester. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with Circle, maybe you've just been brought here today from this webinar to us for the first time. I just want to tell you a little bit about ourselves. So we're the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy, and we're one of 16 Title VI language resource centers that are funded by the Department of Education. And so if this is the first time you've encountered us or these other centers, I'm going to encourage you to visit our website, visit the websites of our sister centers. We all do a lot of professional development, work on creating resources. Many of them are open educational resources and share a lot of things. So after the webinar today, when you have a chance, you can explore all that, and we'll make sure to put the links both for our website and for the kind of common website for all the language resource centers there in the chat for you. This is, as some of you will know, the second in a series that is focusing on integrating social justice in the language classroom. We do have some additional upcoming events. I want to in particular mention Michelle Nicola, who'll be talking on October 17th, and this will be the final in this series focusing on social justice. She'll be presenting on some considerations for social justice teaching in a world language setting, from self to students to world. And so for those of you who already joined us for LJ Randolph's or who will listen into that later when we make it available pretty soon, I think, on video, and who are joining us today for Stacey Margarita Johnson, that's going to kind of round out this series. And then we'll be starting a second series coming up in November that's focusing on literacy. And so please look for that. We'll also put that there in the chat, a link to how to find out more about these events. And then additionally, some of you might be interested in the L2 Digital Literacy Symposium that we have coming up here this month, which is focusing this time on critical transnational dialogue and virtual exchange. And this is even before we were all doing remote and hybrid, this has always been a hybrid event. And so we have digital presentations, and then we'll have a Friday and Saturday, we'll have live streamed events. So if you're interested in technology and language learning or on virtual exchange, please have a look for that. It's also a free event. So at this point, I'm going to turn us to our main event for today, this talk on transformative learning in a social justice oriented classroom. All right, turning now to our presenter. We're very, very lucky to have Stacey Margarita Johnson here with us today. Stacey is the Assistant Director for Educational Technology at the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University. She also holds an appointment as a senior lecturer of Spanish there. She's affiliated faculty in the Center for Second Language Studies, and she's adjunct faculty in the Peabody College's Master's Program for English Language Learners. So in addition to transformative learning, what she'll be talking about with us today, she's an expert in hybrid and blended instruction. I think that's something that we're all thinking and caring about at the moment. And her first book, Hybrid Language Teaching in Practice, Perceptions, Reactions, and Results, came out in 2015. And it's a great resource for those of us who are thinking about these practices at the moment. She also has a second book, Adult Learning in the Language Classroom, which is a wonderful resource for those of us who teach adolescents and adults, that came out that same year. She also works a lot on teacher professional development, something very relevant for us today. And she has a project underway on problem-based models for language and culture teaching. She's written multiple articles on these topics, too many for me to go into listing now, but I just want to highlight a couple that were written actually with our previous speaker, LJ Randolph, that focus on social justice and critical pedagogy in the language classroom. And we'll be sharing actually a website that Circle's been creating. It's a crowdsourced dynamic clearinghouse for resources related to social justice and teaching. And you'll see that those articles are highlighted also on that list. She's also a podcaster, and she's been doing this even since before it was cool. And she's the producer and host of We Teach Languages. And if you're not familiar with that podcast, I heartily recommend it. It's a really great resource for just getting into all of the kinds of discussions that we should be having in our field. Today, she'll be talking with us about transformative learning in a social justice-oriented classroom. Please do join me in welcoming Stacey Margarita Johnson.
I'm really excited to see everyone out there today. I was checking out the list of participants in the chat while everyone was coming in, and I saw a few names that I know, so I'm so excited to have you guys here. And for all of you who I haven't met yet, I'm excited to meet you and get to know you through the chat and the Q&A today. So let me start by sharing my screen and we'll jump right into it. All right. So even though this is a series on social justice, my goal today is really to talk about a type of learning called transformative learning. This is something that is widely discussed in the field of adult learning and adult education. So thinking about from the time people are about in adolescence on how a particular type of real meaningful transformation happens in the way we see the world and the way we interact with the world. It hasn't been as widely applied to language education, but there's actually a growing number of us who are working on this particular topic. Corey Crane from Duke comes to mind. LJ and I always include transformative learning. Chantal mentioned that LJ and I have written several articles together about social justice in particular. And for me, transformative learning really is the vehicle to enact social justice in and through our language teaching. So that's why I'm focusing on that particular topic, because it might not be something we've heard about before, and it has a lot of implications for those of us who are really passionate about making the world a better place. So I would go so far as to say that most of the teachers that I talk to are thinking about social justice because they're in pain reading the news and watching the news and seeing what's happening in our world. And they want, like me also, we all want our teaching to be sites of personal growth, to be sites of professional development, and for the wonderful things that happen in our classrooms to sort of radiate out into the world and not just be about personal transformation, but to be about social transformation as well. I want to inspire my students to be engaged citizens. As a teacher, I maybe hope for transformative learning, and sometimes I have evidence that my students have been transformed. But teachers don't always know how transformative learning happens or how to guide their students to those like big life-changing aha moments that we all know are possible through language study. So when language teaching is at its best, it can connect students to multiple perspectives within the L2 community. It can help students develop intercultural competence. It can lead to social justice outcomes. But what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, what can I do on Tuesday to make the world a better place? That is a little bit harder question. So we're actually going to try and get down to that micro level today. We'll see how we do. All right, we're going to start out by talking about the context of language education. And this is going to be all too familiar because I know we're all doom scrolling through social media all the time, looking at all the things that are happening that are breaking our hearts. So the context for language learning is not going to be a surprise, but I think it's interesting to look at it. Then we're going to talk about what transformative learning is and what the research tells us about how it happens. And then we're going to talk specifically, and this is where I'm going to ask for a lot of input from everyone. We're going to ask specifically about teaching practices that we know as experts in language teaching, we know that they work for language development. But we're going to talk about which of those would also work for transformative outcomes in our classrooms. Excuse me. Okay, so I want y'all to take a second. I'm going to have a little bit of an awkward silence. And if you happen to have a piece of paper nearby that you can jot down, or maybe you can type into your notes app on your laptop there, what actually are the social justice issues you think your language class should be addressing? Is it recent protests? Is it historical injustices? What are the issues? And I'm just going to take a minute to be silent and let y'all think. Okay, I'm looking at the chat and some folks are saying representation, LGBTQ plus issues, immigration, Black Lives Matter, a lot of the things that are weighing on all of us these days. So I think the interesting thing is finding ways, as a teacher, the interesting part for me is finding ways to connect those issues that I'm really interested in with the communities that I'm teaching about. And if you haven't already seen LJ's presentation from a couple weeks ago, he really digs into that really deeply. How do these content items connect with what we're doing in our language classrooms? How can we find the content that we need in order to teach these issues? What are the tech tools that are going to enable us to connect our students to the Spanish-speaking world? And how can we highlight injustices and the communities that are working on these issues in their own families and in their own communities? So keep those things in mind. I'm going to give an example of something that is very important to me to sort of highlight one way that language education supports social justice outcomes. But keep in mind, this is just one example, and you should be thinking about transformative learning through the lens that you've already proposed during your reflection just now. So I think the sort of the rock and the hard place that we find ourselves between is that social justice content in and of itself isn't enough. So I just said, like in the previous slide, LJ did this great presentation about how to access the social justice content, how to integrate it with our learning objectives for our own courses. But the problem is that the way the human brain works, just exposing students to other people's perspectives, just including the content in our courses, gives absolutely no motivation for people to see the world in a new way, validate other people's perspectives. So finding the right articles, the right first person accounts, the right authentic resources, the right topics that tie into our world readiness standards, just including social justice content in our language classrooms isn't enough. In fact, students have no lack of exposure to social justice content. It's not possible to live in the world without seeing examples of injustice everywhere you go. It's not possible to listen to the news without seeing examples of injustice everywhere you go. The problem isn't that we don't know enough about social injustice most of the time. The problem is that we interpret social injustice according to our own experiences instead of being able to decenter ourselves and put ourselves into someone else's position, really thoroughly take in someone else's perspective and have sort of the empathy and humility required to elevate someone else's ideas above our own. So the example that I'm going to talk about today is multilingualism. This is a relatively ubiquitous problem, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. But English-speaking countries tend to suffer from this in a very particular way for some reason. So I'm going to show you this photo right here of this gentleman. It says, "Man screams at Spanish-speaking restaurant staff to speak English." This is not just any man. This is a lawyer in New York City who is very highly educated. And in fact, his firm advertises that he can speak Spanish. So he accepts Spanish-speaking clients, which I think is very interesting, that his ability to understand that language skills are useful for commerce, his ability to use language instrumentally, his ability to even study enough of a language to get a high school and a college degree and a doctorate and then talk about being a bilingual person. None of those things were enough to keep him from going on a tirade that people should speak English because they're in America. Here's another one. This was another educated woman telling Latina shoppers that they should not speak Spanish. They're in America. Here's another one. This gentleman's at a Cracker Barrel. And this is an article where Latinas tell their firsthand accounts of all the horrible things that have happened to them when they were speaking Spanish in public. Now, I happen to have chosen Spanish examples here because I do teach Spanish, but anyone who speaks a language other than English while not benefiting from sort of white middle-class American privileges in the United States has horror stories of being told they are in America, they should speak English. And there's a lot of really excellent research right now. Nelson comes to mind. I want to make sure to get some good citations together, but about how bilingualism is really something that only affluent white people in America are allowed to have access to. Everyone else needs to speak English. And this is a consistent problem. Multilingualism is just not something we value. And people suffer microaggressions and outright injustices as a result of speaking languages other than English. Just in case we're inclined to believe that this is something that has happened in the last 4 years because of the current political climate and sort of the high level of attention that immigration is getting in the last few years, it is absolutely not. This is endemic to the United States. It almost seems to be weaved into some of our cultural institutions that English is the default language. Here's a really good example of this. In 2014, which, as you all know, was during the previous presidential administration, Coca-Cola put a commercial on the Super Bowl where people sang "America the Beautiful" in different languages. There was a huge racist backlash to that commercial in real time. You can see here that all of these tweets that I'm highlighting are from right around 6:50 p.m. on February 2nd, 2014. That's the exact time that the commercial aired. People saying they'll never drink another Coke again. How can you have a commercial where they sing "God Bless America" in a foreign language? Can you imagine that? How could God possibly bless America in any language but English? Who thought of singing "God Bless America"? Okay, sorry, Coke, but you can't sing "God Bless America" in different languages. That defeats the purpose. I love that turn of phrase because it gives us so much insight into how this person thinks about America. It actually defeats the purpose of America to sing a patriotic song in different languages. So that must mean that the purpose of America is to exclude anyone who's not a native English speaker. This last one, that Coke commercial was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. This is freaking America. Once again, that essentialism, we're getting a lot of insight into a prevailing common sense that it's not limited to just a few people. And many people who have this belief don't consider themselves racist or xenophobic. It's just common sense to them that "God Bless America" happens in English. And how dare anyone break that really well-established convention. So Chantel mentioned my books. I will actually tell you, do not go out and buy that first one about hybrid teaching. It doesn't make any sense in the context of the new reality. That book, we need to burn all the copies of it. It's not a good book. But the second one, Adult Learning in the Language Classroom, that actually talks about students' experiences specifically of transformation while studying in a first semester Spanish class in this case. And here is one of the students who was in that class who I interviewed as a researcher. I was not the instructor of the class. Someone else taught it. I was just a researcher who was embedded in the classroom doing a case study of what students were experiencing. And I discovered that students were bringing these same assumptions of multilingualism into this first semester language classroom. I thought that somebody who is teaching in an American school should have English as their first language. I know that sounds ignorant, but with the accent, It's like I have to do a little more work to understand what she says sometimes when I shouldn't have to. Other than Spanish, which I have to figure out, I also have to play with her English. So here's things where things get serious for me as a language teacher. It's not just the world out there that's full of these messages about who gets to speak English and what accents are okay and where we speak what languages. We all live in a world where the assumptions that are the prevailing wisdom and common sense are baked into our world and baked into our interaction. It's like they're in the air all around us. These prevailing messages are inside of us, even if you think they aren't. If you grew up in a society where that was the air around you and every day you were breathing it in and breathing it out, it gets baked inside of you. This is why people often say we have to check our privilege or evaluate our privilege, because if that's the prevailing wisdom of the place where we live, it's very hard to dig out all the roots of that and really understand how those ideas have affected the way we interact with people. This student, for better or for worse, came into class with a particular ideology, a set of assumptions about how language works, about who's allowed to speak language, and about what accent they should use. Our own students in our classrooms right now have inherited these messages from their environment. And as a little aside here, we're going to talk about our students' transformative learning, but as language teachers, I challenge you to really think about the way racist ideologies and social injustices are the air that you breathe as well. How am I, as a language teacher, affected by breathing in all of these common sense assumptions about how language works, or about how race works, or about how race and language interplay? How have they affected the way I've interacted with people or the way I've interpreted reality? It is a lifelong work to dig the roots out of that and really figure out who I am and improve. And I would say that is definitely something where I often feel a little bit like maybe I shouldn't be doing social justice oriented webinars, because I am definitely in the process of trying to evaluate who am I, what am I breathing in, and how can I do better? But our students, back to students, our students do definitely come into our classrooms with these assumptions, and we can't assume that they don't, because that's the world we live in. So all the student quotes I'm going to share today are from one particular student that I interviewed for that study back in 2015. His name was 10, and he had a lot of interesting things to say, none of which he shared with his teacher. He shared them with me because I was a researcher, sort of like a safe third party, but his teacher never had any idea that he came into class with all of these assumptions. Here's another gem from 10. He said, I used to get really mad when I'd be driving and I'd see a billboard in Spanish. I worked at the zoo for a while, and when the kids came in, I'd be talking to the kids because the parents don't effing speak English. I used to get really annoyed when I'd see a commercial in Spanish. You know, last time I checked, this was the United States of America. I just want to show you that the prevailing attitudes are no different between this horrible tweet from 2014 and this student who had very similar things to say about whether parents at the zoo should be speaking Spanish with their children. He didn't realize when he started the Spanish class that that assumption was problematic. He had a lot of other assumptions too, and a lot of the other students that I interviewed in the class had different assumptions about different things that they brought into the classroom, and they didn't even know they were problematic. They'd just been breathing it in for so long, it felt natural to breathe it out. The good news that I want to share here is that as a result of taking a language class, this student had a transformative experience and completely reevaluated some of these assumptions. And the reason he was able to articulate these things during our interviews is because he had realized, oh, wow, I have some pretty messed up ways of thinking about multilingualism. It's time for me to really think this through more. So we'll talk a little bit more about his transformation once we get to the end. But I just wanted to let you know there's a happy ending for 10. So what is transformative learning? Just as a brief definition, when adults reevaluate previously held beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions and begin to interpret experience in a new way. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with someone who is on a very opposite side of an issue than you, but sometimes I'll get in these conversations where someone's like on the polar opposite from me, because I have a lot of friends and family who I often disagree with about things that are serious political issues for me. And I will think to myself, how in the world did we both start out at A and yet I got to B and they got to like 412? Like, how did I go from A to B and they got from A to 412? And I know that they're looking at me and thinking the same way. They can't figure out, they can't connect the dots of how I got from the same starting point to where I am. And a lot of times this has to do with what's called a meaning perspective. So my meaning perspective is like a filter through which I understand experience. It's how when data comes in through my senses, my meaning perspective looks for patterns in that data so that I can make sense of it. My meaning perspective helps me discover that, oh, these aren't just random events that are happening, but these are part of a larger picture, and it helps me make sense of that larger picture. Now, the problem with a meaning perspective is it's taking in a ton of data all the time through our senses, and it is trying to make sense of it. And so a lot of times our meaning perspectives, our brains will take shortcuts to make sense of everything that we're learning. And those shortcuts are often that prevailing common sense, prevailing wisdom that we've breathed in. So I actually want to talk about what transformative learning is not. A lot of times when we talk about transformation in general, we use a butterfly as an example, right? So from an external perspective, a caterpillar like eats and then goes into a chrysalis and then emerges a butterfly, and that's a transformation. But the changing of a caterpillar into a butterfly is not anything like the kind of transformation that we're talking about here for a few reasons. One, transformative learning is not a one-time thing. If you are doing it right, you will always be transforming. You will always be moving towards something better. Our students don't come into our classes untransformed and then leave transformed and then it's over. If we do our jobs, then we get students started on a path of transformation and they spend their whole lives transforming as they discover new ways of seeing the world, new assumptions, new beliefs. Transformative learning is also not inevitable. Like people don't have to transform. It is possible to live your entire life believing everything that you were told in your family unit, in your community, in your social unit with no external inputs, no transformation. It's possible to live in that very defined social order and not resist anything that you've been given. Unlike a caterpillar that can't just choose not to become a butterfly, right? So it's not the same. It's also not consistent across instances. So 2 students in my classroom might have very different experiences of transformation. And I might have a very different experience of transformation as I'm adopting anti-racist pedagogies that might be transformative for me. But that feeling is very different than the feeling of the experience of transformation I have around multilingualism. Every time I experience transformative learning, it might be different for me. So it's not consistent across instances. And it's also not a process that teachers can micromanage or force. So there is nothing that I can do to make sure my students transform. I'm powerless. I can't force it. I can encourage it and I can set the stage for it, which is what we're going to talk about next. But I can't force it and I'm not in charge of it. It's not something you can put in your syllabus. It's not something you can put in your assessments. This is not going to tie into your learning objectives like social justice content will. And I think that's one of the reasons why this can be a little hard for us as teachers, is if something is so nebulous and so uncontrollable and so personal that there's no way for me to force it to happen or account for it having happened, then what am I doing with it, right? Well, this is how people become better people. This is how we learn to see the world in a new way. This is how we expand and grow and reach our potential. So while it might not be in my learning objectives, it is actually one of the goals of my course. I'm really upfront with my language students that my goal for you is that you will encounter so many new ways of experiencing reality that you'll realize that we don't have to stay in the little box we're in. We don't have to live in this tiny defined reality. The world is bigger than that, and we can be bigger too. All right, so there's sort of a dichotomy in the kinds of learning I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to use two different terms. One is transformative and one is instrumental. Instrumental outcomes are actually all the things that are on my syllabus, all of my learning objectives for my students. So if you come at this from like a cognitive perspective, you might say that's the declarative and the procedural knowledge. Most college instructors would call it the course content, every single thing I'm trying to teach. You might say, if you're use more of a traditional model of language instruction, you might say this is the grammar and vocabulary, right? So at the college I teach at, we use a fairly traditional textbook, and in every chapter there is like, here are the specific grammar points students have to learn, and then there's a test on them. Here's the vocabulary they have to learn, and then they have to learn how to put it all together and use it in context. And so that all the stuff, every single morsel of learning in those textbooks is instrumental. And if you have more of an acquisition, comprehension focused approach, then you might say the learning and the acquisition that happens in a classroom, that's all instrumental. None of that is transformative. This is what you have to acquire as part of a course, but it's not something that changes the way you see the world. What changes the way you see the world are social justice outcomes, like students will be able to take action in their community towards specific justice oriented ideas, making sense of experience in new ways. And we'll see that 10 is a really good example of how students literally understand what comes through their senses differently. They actually experience physical sensation differently after they've gone through transformative learning, which to me is remarkable. Critically reflecting on and adopting new language ideologies, and also intercultural competence. This is something that I love reading the research on intercultural competence, because I see so many overlaps between the transformative learning processes I'm talking about and the different intercultural scales, moving from a very ethnocentric to a more relative perspective. The underlying process that drives that ethno-relative process is a transformative learning process. And, you know, I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, but I love interruptions. So if you guys want to put anything in the Q&A, Chantel already told me that she would stop me, interrupt me in the middle and ask me the question, because I don't want to miss any of your questions. So please, Chantel, feel free to interrupt me, and feel free to use the Q&A, everybody.
So far, everyone's talking in the chat, and there's some great discussion going on that you'll have to go back and read later, but the Q&A is pretty quiet. I think that's because you're being so clear.
Well, that's very kind. Just thank you. And I can't wait to catch up on the chat later. Okay, so what is transformative learning look like? Here is my little word art model that I made for you guys. This is a very simplified model, but we have our meaning perspective. This is like the bubble we live in. This is the filter through which we interpret everything. And the meaning perspective is often challenged by an event that's called a disorienting dilemma. A disorienting dilemma is when we come across something that we cannot explain through our existing meaning perspective. So the person who I use as a model, that, you know, there's different researchers who work on this and they all use very slightly different ways of thinking about transformative learning. But the person that I follow is named Mesro. And one of the things that he said in his very large scale studies on this is that experiencing a different culture or language, experiencing a different way of being is very likely to result in a disorienting dilemma. Because when I see Oh, well, I am one of the things that my students sometimes find to be a disorienting dilemma, for example, is when we talk about what age a person should leave home. So I have undergraduate college students. I spent several years teaching at the community college level specifically. And so when I would tell my students that it would be perfectly normal in the place where I studied Spanish for a 30-year-old to live at home with their parents, of course, because, you know, housing is very expensive. And why wouldn't you want to live with your family? That's a very convenient thing to do. And some of the 30-year-olds in my class, you know, had like kids in middle school and are working 2 jobs and are taking this class at night to improve their life. And they're like, how could someone my age still be single and living at home with their parents? It's a disorienting dilemma. Reality doesn't make sense through this lens that you're showing me. And so when you see people living in a very different way, experiencing things in a very different way, disorienting dilemmas are likely to happen. If students can move into a stage of critical reflection at that point, which would be like taking time to reflect, not just reflecting on what you've seen, but reflecting on your own choices and how your own upbringing and different power relationships might have affected the choices you make. If they're able to take some action based on what they've learned, it's possible for them to make it all the way to what's called integration. And integration is just where this new way of being is incorporated into your meaning perspective, and your meaning perspective gets a little bigger. Anna asked, would you include critical pedagogy in this kind of theoretical framework? I am not sure what kind of theoretical framework this question's about. Did I already pass the point where it made sense? Maybe you could give me some more information and I'd love to answer it live. Oh, I'm guessing this is about slide 13. Is that right?
I think it did come up then, so we'll see. Oh, Anna says yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is actually about the learning process. So all the things that change in our students' heads can be either instrumental or transformative, whereas critical pedagogy is going to be teaching choices that we make, not so much learning experiences. And those teaching choices are going to show up starting right here. Can you guys see my mouse when I move it around? Okay, so starting with the disorienting dilemma, the teaching choices that we make to help move students through critical reflection and then action are what I would call critical pedagogy. And actually it starts before that. It starts with showing students things that might cause disorienting dilemmas, helping them critically reflect on what they've experienced, and then helping them take action. This is actually my framework that I use for critical pedagogy. So I would say slide 13 here is about what's happening in our students' heads, while critical pedagogy is about what we're doing to kind of move students along. Now, the problem with transformative learning is it's actually very rare, because if every time we had a disorienting dilemma, if we took the time to critically reflect and then take action based on that, we would be exhausted people who never had time for anything but transformation. It would be all we did, because transformative learning is long and hard and often psychologically very painful. And our brains can't take it. Every time we see someone make a different choice than us, we can't critically reflect on that. We wouldn't get anything else done. So what normally happens, I call this the escape valve right here. Students have their own meaning perspective. They find a disorienting dilemma in the world or in the classroom. And then instead of moving forward with critical reflection, they decide to take the back way out and just make sense of reality in the usual way. What this might look like is saying, man, that culture is so weird. I knew that they were crazy. My way is obviously the right way. Why wouldn't they do it my way? Sometimes this level of ethnocentrism also looks like fetishization of a culture. So it might be something like, ooh, they're so exotic and exciting. And I mean, you could never do that in real life, but it's so cool that this exotic culture does this all the time. They're sort of like a glass menagerie that I can examine whenever I want to, right? And don't have to spend too much time thinking about or interacting with. So the escape hatch is how we get through our lives. Just that doesn't make any sense, but I don't have to critically reflect on it. I just have to move on to the next thing. And in language classrooms, it can be even more damaging. It can be a really ethnocentric way of approaching language study, which once again, if you listen to LJ's presentation last week, you're going to be very familiar with this because he talked about all the damaging ways that we have traditionally taught culture in language classrooms, which in a large part do not push students to critically reflect on difference. They push students to see difference as exciting or exotic or just really a superficial matter of costumes and food and not real differences in the way that we experience reality. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what transformation is, I know that all of us who've been teaching for any length of time have experienced real transformation alongside of our students. Like we've seen students really change the way they think about the world and the way they interact with the world. And so I'm curious, what kinds of activities promote transformative learning in your language classroom? Are there things that you're doing where you're noticing that students are moving into critical reflection and then into action and not just explaining away difference in some simplistic way? And once again, I'm going to give you a little awkward silence to think about it. I especially like the one that I'm seeing here that talks about a panel of guest speakers from different communities, because that's something that my research has uncovered as something really important, is for the communities that we're teaching about, not just to be like imagined communities, but for students to develop real affection for real people. I personally feel very strongly that I don't want to send my first semester students out into the community yet. I don't think they're linguistically or interculturally competent enough to make it sort of in real communities without possibly causing harm to those communities. Just not yet, not at the first semester level. And so a panel of guest speakers sounds like a real opportunity to engage with students. I also see a lot of people mentioning different kinds of authentic resources, novels, and cultural activities and different things that I would put into the category of giving students access to communities by including authentic resources that show first-person accounts from those communities. There's so many, I don't have time to read them all, but really, really excellent chat. I appreciate all of y'all's contributions. And I definitely can see that we're on the same page also. We know intuitively some of the things that work for transformative learning, and we're including them in our class because they're good for language learning and because they're good for transformation. Okay, so you don't have to read all of this. This is Mesro's Stages of Transformative Learning. So we have limited time to talk about what practices we want to include. So what I want to do is show you that these very complicated 10 steps that Mesro lists actually aren't that complicated. There's some real patterns here. So let's look at it this way. What I've done here, oh, and I see there's more Q&A. So let me look at the Q&A again before we move on. So there's a really good question here about textbooks. And I think I'm going to actually save this question because we're going to talk about materials a little bit more later. I think it's an excellent question. And I at the school that I teach at, I don't have any control over the textbook we use, but that has been true of every place I've ever taught. Like I've never been in a situation where I could say, yes, I will just do my own thing all by myself without taking the department into consideration. For most of us, at least at the college level, that's not something that we really get to do. So I think learning to work with the textbook you have, understanding that no textbook is perfect. Most of them aren't anywhere close to perfect, but learning to work with the textbook you have and make it more transformational or more open to social justice outcomes is a great question. So let's return back to that. And we have a TA in Spanish who used the CLT method. Is there any method or approach that will work better? You know, That's an excellent question. And I'm going to say no. And back in the 2015 book about adult learning, I looked at two different things that were happening in the classroom. One was the student experience, but the other one was the methods that the instructor was actually using in the classroom. And the methods that the instructor was using were very traditional. There was a lot of grammar instruction in English. Students memorized vocabulary lists, and they did communicative activities in pairs or groups of 3. And my assessment is that transformation, there might be methods, let me say, there might be methods where you have to follow them so strictly that the teacher doesn't actually have room to sort of follow what they see happening in the classroom. If you have that kind of a method that you're working with, I think that could be problematic. But every teacher I've really ever met is using a hodgepodge of some provided materials from a publisher or authentic resources or something, some compromise with people in their department. So everyone's not doing exactly what they want, but we're all doing something, that we can all agree to. And then some of just what we think is best practice. It's always a hodgepodge, and we're always throwing things in. Oh, this worked really well 3 years ago, but this is something new I'm trying. And I think that's normal in teaching. And I really think method doesn't have as much to do with it as actually being attuned to what your students are experiencing and giving them some opportunities. So this is a good segue for me to get back to this slide. So we have this long list of things that people have to do to get through the transformative process. And we also know that it can take years for a person to go through this. It might take months, it might take years to fully experience transformation. So what I've done here, number one, you have to have a disorienting dilemma, but I actually think that language classrooms are full of disorienting dilemmas just by their very nature. So we don't really have to focus on that very much. The next thing I did is I highlighted in red all of the activities in this transformative framework that have to do with critically reflecting, or what I like to call mining your internal resources. So this is one person looking within themselves to figure out, what do they need? What do they feel? What do they have at their disposal? What are they going to do next? That sort of critical reflection piece inside of the person. And everything that I've highlighted in blue here is relational activities. So things you have to do with other people, ways that you have to connect with others in order to transform. Transformation actually isn't possible in isolation. We transform when we are loved and challenged by people around us. That's another reason I love LJ, is in my work with LJ, he constantly challenges me to do better. And I hope that he would say the same to me. Having a group of critical teacher friends who love me and challenge me and won't accept that I just accept something for what it is has been critical to my own course. And I hope you guys have that. And if you don't, make friends with people in the chat, because this is a big group of like-minded people and we need to stick together. That's one of the reasons I have my Twitter handle up here, by the way, on every slide, because I always need more critical friends to challenge me. So if you want to connect with me on Twitter, I would love to get to know you.
Stacey, real quick, there's a question from Veronica, which I think you were actually just answering. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it in there, which is, does transformative learning include the idea of the teacher being a learner with the students too? And the teacher then also needing to evaluate their own transformation? And I think in some ways you were just talking about the role of critical friends and facilitating that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And it does fit in really well here. So transformative learning is not, it's a social process, but it is not one that is necessarily based in classrooms. So we're taking sort of a cognitive process that adults go through and applying it to what happens in classrooms. So there's not a perfect one-to-one match. Like in my real life, I don't usually have a teacher who has authority over me and is grading me, sort of challenging me in different ways, right? I have critical friends. However, I will tell you in my 2015 study, one of the things that was really interesting is that over and over, their native speaker teacher who was very passionate about social justice issues and brought them into class whenever she could, was consistently the person who first showed them the disorienting dilemma, helped them learn how to critically reflect on it and get over those sort of feelings of guilt and shame. And she also became a key member of their community, a key person that they had a relationship with who helped them move forward into action. So I would say transformative learning models don't account for the sort of power differential between teacher and learner. They just see all the people in the classroom as adults who are in need of transformation. All of us are in need of transformation. And how does that work for us? The power differential is you actually have to maybe apply another framework to start thinking about what does it mean to be a teacher or a learner in a space if we are all in need of transformation, right? Okay, so we have the red, which is the internal processes, the blue that are the relational processes. And then I also just want to point out number 7 real quick, because number 7 is where students learn the knowledge and the skills that they need to implement their plans. Way back up here in slide 13, we talked about instrumental and transformative learning. So this has to do with language learning motivation, okay? Once students start the process of transformation, once they're well on their way, we no longer have to explain to them why instrumental learning is useful. They no longer need a grade in order to learn this stuff. They no longer need external motivation in order to learn. Because what happens with the process of transformation is they become self-directed learners who say, I want to understand the world and the way people see the world. I want to know more. And so I need to acquire specific knowledge and skills in order to do that. All of our different learning frameworks are all coming together in the transformative learning model. If you want students to increase their language learning motivation, then you have to give them a transformative learning path through which to do that. And finally, the very last steps here that are in white, these are all action steps. Acquisition, building competence and self-confidence, and then reintegrating into one's life with your new perspective. That's all action that students need to take. So step 1, this is where the pedal hits the metal or the rubber hits the road or whatever the metaphor is. We have to provide our students with disorienting dilemmas. I have some specific ways I like to do that. Contact with L2 communities, either in person or through authentic resources. And as I mentioned earlier, there was some talk in the chat of other ways. I don't know if you guys have used virtual exchange in any way, but I've heard good things about that. Someone mentioned a panel of guest speakers. The students in the study that I keep mentioning found contact with their teacher extremely useful. They felt like their teacher was their gateway to the L2 community. Now, I'm not a native speaker, and so I don't know if my students see me, a non-native speaker who has voluntarily entered a community of speakers different from my native language, right? I don't know if they see me as that same sort of contact. I hope they do, actually. But I know that the instructor in this study, her students got to know her and loved her. And that affection and relationship that they developed with her over the course of the semester led to them feeling like they had an entry into this new world and this new community. And it was a source of tons of disorienting dilemmas for them. Exploring cultural and linguistic differences. I mean, there's some downsides to always talking about differences all the time, which LJ outlined really well in the previous webinar. But it's actually seeing that everything doesn't have to be the way my mama taught me. Like everything doesn't have to fit into the box I grew up in. There are other ways of seeing the world. Differences can be really useful in the classroom. So we don't want to eliminate talking about differences. We just want to talk about differences in a way that's not othering or harmful. And then finally, one of the really interesting transformations that happened over and over in the studies that I've conducted on this is students came to their own limitations as a language learner. They realized how hard language learning is and how every time they see someone speak in English that is obviously not a native speaker's English, that is someone who has learned English better than they have learned Spanish. That's mind-blowing. So confronting one's own limitations as a language learner turned out to be a real cool source of disorienting dilemmas. Now, I'm going to get back to the textbook thing right now. If your textbook is not presenting authentic voices from L2 communities, then this is a deficiency. I was lucky enough to use a textbook for my first year Spanish courses a few years ago that the 100% of the textbook was people telling their real people in real communities talking in the first person. There was some of it was written and some of it was audio. And so when I used that textbook, I didn't feel like I needed to bring in a lot of other authentic resources because there were so many people in the textbook telling their own story. However, that textbook wasn't perfect either, none are. Other textbooks that I have used, going back for the 20 years or so that I've been teaching, typically don't have a lot of authentic resources. They do other things well, maybe, but not authentic resources. And that is often because authentic resources are hard to copyright. And the language isn't always totally comprehensible. And so in a first year book, you might want to have a little simpler language. Also, authentic resources that are like the directions for how to get to the aquarium from here, that might be really interesting and really good for language learning, but it's not likely to promote the sort of disorienting dilemma that you get when you learn about someone's life and learn about the things that have happened to them and hear their story and their identity and their history from their own mouth, right? So if you are evaluating a textbook, that might be something that you keep in mind. So the question here about textbooks for English speakers, sorry, I'm just pulling it back up. All the textbooks I've ever used were designed specifically for English speakers, demonstrating that language learning is wholly dependent on translation from English to the target language, and I often struggle with getting students out of that mode of thinking. That is really tough, and I would say that for me, what solves that problem isn't really about transformative learning or textbooks, but it's about moving language instruction from the written textbook mode to the oral interpersonal interaction mode. I'm not sure how that fits into this, this presentation, but I find that focusing language learning on orality rather than literacies during class time really helps with that for me. And I guess in some way that is part of my overall belief that language learning is about getting to know real people and allowing that experience to change who I am. And so in my classroom, I really want my students to have the tools to meet new people, get to know them, get to know important things about them, not just like, you know, what color shirt are you wearing and what year are you in, what's your phone number, but to know important things about who we are and what we believe and how we interact with the world, right? But I think textbooks can be a great resource, but I've never met one that didn't need help. And so these disorienting dilemmas are going to come from you telling stories of the target culture, your own experiences. They're going to come from bringing L2 community members into your class through authentic resources or panel discussions, and really giving students the freedom to explore linguistic and cultural differences to the extent that that makes sense for them.
Stacey, there's, I think, a kind of related question here too about combating tokenism. And I think that's maybe one of the things that happens in a lot of textbooks is that you have this sort of cultural translation approach, which results in tokenism. So I don't know if you want to speak to that or if we can bring it back in later.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to speak about that. The problem is that if the typical textbook will cover, 12 countries in a semester. And so if you're trying to give students everything they need to know about 12 countries in one semester, I think, how are you possibly going to avoid tokenism? It doesn't feel like a possible thing to me. What we're talking about is having a smaller number of people and places that we're learning about, but going deeper because we're hearing from actual people who live there. So once again, I'm going to refer back to LJ's presentation from last week because he goes into a lot of depth about how to do this. But one of the things that he does is really focuses on US Latin identity in his early semester classrooms, people who identify as Black and Latino. Let's hear specifically from them about their experiences. So I'm not telling students about a culture. I am finding people who are talking about themselves and the way they live, and then introducing my students to those people and allowing those people to speak for themselves. Does that make sense? Okay, so a next question. So is the main key in transforming, in fact, the teacher who acts as a role model, mirror through reflection? Well, once again, I don't know that for sure. The teacher was really influential. And I'll also tell you that in order to choose a classroom to study, the first thing I did is do a large scale survey of students in a lot of different language classrooms and try to find out which classrooms were experiencing transformation at a higher rate. And consistently through all my surveys, there was one particular teacher in this college who students were consistently experiencing some sort of transformation in her classroom. And so I did a case study of her classroom so that I could learn more about the types of things she was doing that were promoting transformation. This person would have told you that she was not the best language teacher. She didn't know anything about methodology. She didn't actually have any interest in methodology. She used a textbook and did what the textbook told her. But what she did is every time the textbook would say something that she thought was sort of essentializing or maybe wrong or maybe different from her own experience, she would bring in films, commercials, personal anecdotes, authentic resources. She would bring those in to complement what the textbook was doing. Now, I would bring those things in as a language learning device, right? Because I want my students to experience authentic language. She was doing it because she wanted her students to experience who Spanish speakers were and to really feel like they got to know actual people. And she started with herself. I don't think the way she did it is the only way to do it. I think the teacher, I also know that she had no idea her students were transforming. She didn't understand at all that her students were leaving her class different than when they came in. And I think as teachers, we often don't know what impact our teaching is having on our students. Another thing I'll tell you is that transformative learning is so interconnected between the things that happen to us outside of class and the things that happen to us in class, that it's really hard to figure out how much of this transformation was already happening when the student came to class and we just pushed them along, and how much of it started in my class, but it finished afterwards in some other way. So no, I don't think that the teacher has the last say in transformation, but I do think that there are things we can do to push it along, and helping students develop affection for and knowledge of specific individuals within our language communities is really important. This is part of that relational thing, right? We have to know a person, not just know a big homogenous group of people. We have to know a person. And I'm going to go ahead and look at this other question while I'm here. Is the idea of speaking like a native speaker, American English, a dilemma too, now that we talk about world Englishes? Oh, Veronica, I think about this all the time. I get so frustrated in my own meeting perspective. I definitely grew up. I have a California accent, and I grew up thinking that California accents are the default, and people who talk like me have the default accent, and people who speak English as a native speaker from different places in the world have an accent that might be very different from me, and it's not the default, right? And the further you get away from my accent, the more accented your speech is, because mine is accentless. And this is something that I have been working on my entire adult life, but it's part of our prevailing wisdom. If someone is a native speaker of English with a Nigerian accent, then most North American English speakers would ask them where they're from and how did they learn how to speak English. I think I am personally in the middle of my transformation here, and I hope a lot of our students are as well, especially with the languages we teach. we have a little bit more clarity that the French spoken in Paris isn't the only valid form of French spoken, right? I have that clarity. I have that clarity because I am a non-native speaker of French. However, I might not have that same clarity about the English that I grew up speaking. I don't know if that answered the question well. I'm going to scooch forward, and because there's 4 different categories of teaching techniques, so I'm going to scooch forward a little bit and then come back to the Q&A. So first is disorienting dilemmas, which I think we're actually, teachers are mostly pretty good at giving students opportunities to have contact with L2 communities and explore cultural and linguistic differences. Next, this is something we are not as good at, and I am not going to try to go through this because internal reflective processes are an entire webinar on their own, but I do want you all to read an article by Corey Crane and Mike Sosolsky that came out in the spring in the Foreign Language Annals. It's specifically about structured reflection as a tool towards transformative learning, and it is awesome. You will enjoy it. And it gives a lot more detail here. What I will tell you is that internal reflective processes are an exploration of not just our own rational responses, not just what we think, but what we feel. If we're not prompting our students to be integrated between what they're feeling and what they're thinking, then we're missing out on a big part of transformation. Have you ever experienced that feeling when something happened and you couldn't make sense of it and you felt either angry or scared or maybe a little sick to your stomach? It kind of grossed you out. Negative emotional responses are really important indicators that transformation is starting, that transformation is happening, that students have an opportunity. So I want to go back to those horrible tweets that we looked at earlier. As a transformative learning scholar, when I see someone say, "Who thought of singing God Bless America in any language other than English?" Obviously, I see someone who's very angry. I see someone who is at the beginning of transformative learning. I see someone who's experiencing negative emotional responses and is trying to understand how come the meaning perspective that they've had their entire lives can't help them make sense of this commercial that's making them feel bad. I want my students to note when they feel bad. I want to know when they feel bad. I don't want my class to be an artificially, toxically positive place. I want it to be a place where we can say, well, that made me feel terrible. What's going on with that? Why do I feel bad? If I feel bad, I think I need to explore it more. And I want my students to be aware that their emotions are a part of their learning. Also, internal reflective processes require students to assess their own assumptions. What is it that you believe about God Bless America that makes singing it in a language other than English wrong? Let's really dig into that. What are your assumptions about that song and about our language? And internal reflective processes are also about thinking forward. So here's where I've come from. Here's where I am now. What are the next steps? What are the, I don't know if you guys can hear people singing in the room with me, but I have happy children in this room. So what are the next steps that you are going to take? If we chart your trajectory from where you started to where you are now, where do you go from here? And please check out this Foreign Language Annals article. It's so good. And finally, there's relational processes. So this is something I want my students to do as part of my class. And a lot of language teachers are great at this. We are a group of people who are learning language together. Language actually can't even be learned by myself. Language is by its nature a social activity, right? So I need a group of people that I trust enough that I believe they will listen when I want to communicate a message, and that I like enough that when they communicate a message, I will listen, right? In order for communication to happen, we have to have trust and affection. That's just how it works. So how do I create those relationships among my learners? Because I know they're necessary. And also going back to the idea of critical friendships, how do I make it a safe place where we can challenge each other a little bit, push each other's thinking, move people in new directions? I would also say recognizing that other people in the class are having a similar experience to you is not something that students in the class that I studied in the 2015 book, they didn't really know that. The teacher didn't know transformation was happening. They didn't talk about it amongst themselves, but where they did get that sense of group membership is they, one example is they watched the Salma Hayek movie about the Mirabal sisters in the Dominican Republic, who were these sisters who resisted a dictator and, very famous social justice advocates in their community and have a historical legacy in the Dominican Republic. And so they watched this movie, and because it was a big Hollywood movie and a fiction account, it was just very well done and very dramatic. And a lot of, particularly the women in the classroom, felt a shared community with the Mirabal sisters of saying, my community also has struggled for social justice, and the women in my community have also been very brave in the face of dictators and bad actors. And so what I feel a sense of solidarity now with these women from this movie in particular. And there were a lot of examples of also authentic resources in addition to movies and fiction, where I might not have realized students in my class were experiencing transformation, but I got to see people fighting for justice in their own communities in the Spanish speaking world and realize that I feel solidarity with these people I've never met in person. And that was a really important process for them as well. And the very last thing is taking action. So in order to finish the process of transformation, you have to do something. So you have the disorienting dilemma, you critically reflect, you have relationships that get you through the transformation, but you have to try on new roles. You have to try new things. You have to develop confidence that, yes, this new way of thinking about the world really does help me interact with the world better. And the only way you develop that confidence is by trying. I also really like, since I can't actually ask my students to go into communities and do justice, but I can ask them to imagine what they would do. So a very small example of that. In one of the classes, a second semester Spanish class that I taught maybe 7 years ago, there was in the food unit, we did a reading about the reality of chocolate production and how it's resulted in a lot of basically slavery and chocolate plantations, and how it can be really bad for communities where it's not regulated. We also compared that to colonial efforts to grow chocolate and other, plantation type crops. And it was really, really comprehensible snippets. And we didn't go into too much detail, but we talked about how much we like chocolate. We read about the dangers of slavery in the chocolate industry in the current day. And we also read a little bit about chocolate and other kinds of plantations in colonial times. And then I asked students, after we read those three things and processed them linguistically, I asked students, based on what we've learned, this was in English because they were second semester students. I said, based on what you learned, how do you want to put this into practice? The follow-up question was very simple. In Spanish, give an activity that you can do today. I didn't ask them to actually do the activity. I just asked them to name an activity. And students said something like, hablar con amigos, like talk with my friends, or not buy a particular brand of chocolate, or, read the label on my chocolate, things that are actually very easy to say in the target language. The next day, one of my students came back to class and said that she had gone to the snack bar on campus, realized every single brand of chocolate bar was one of the ones that were on the list of companies that we'd read had bad practices, and told the snack bar manager, these companies all participate in slave labor to grow their chocolate. Can we please get a free fair trade certified, slavery-free certified chocolate, because I don't want to buy these brands anymore. So despite me not requiring any action, she was able to take the lessons from our class that day because I asked her to imagine what might she do next. And what she imagined was she was going to start reading the chocolate labels, and that had real consequences for her life. It's a very small example, but it's one I cherish a lot. Okay, so I'm going to go back to 10. 10 built a very positive relationship with his instructor, and it was that relational process for him that really moved him forward. He said, I don't have the random anger that I had before. Now, as opposed to getting mad when I hear Spanish, I try to, more than anything, pay more attention to it because I want to figure out what they're saying. It's kind of flipped. I don't shun it like I did before. And a lot of it has to do with the instructor's presentation of who she is and how it's presented to me in a way I'm seeing as a positive thing. He went on to talk about how he had never had a meaningful relationship with a Spanish speaker before. And developing one meaningful relationship with one Spanish speaker was enough for him to see the humanity in all the other Spanish speakers he came in contact with at his job. Here's more from 10. Every day as part of this class, and it was actually part of the research I was doing, every day in the last few minutes of class, they got a little handout where they had to write, has anything happened outside of class that connects to what we're doing in class? One of the crazy things, I'm trying not to use ableist language like crazy, and it is a hard habit to break. So let me rephrase. One of the fascinating things that happened as a result of some of my research methods, like asking students to do a daily survey during class, was that daily survey was cited by many students in the class as being one of the activities that led to their transformation. So 10 in particular said, I'm trying to integrate the things that she's teaching. So he made it all the way in one semester. He made it from having the disorienting dilemma. He critically reflected. He had that relational process that helped it along. And then he said, now I'm trying to integrate the things she's teaching. So he made it all the way to the action stage. I like how she presents the class, and I like those things that we fill out every day that says, has anything happened outside of class? I really like that. And just that question, just being asked, it makes me want to have an answer. Just the fact that you care or you want to know, is any of this affecting my life other than just for school and grades? It makes me want to have a good answer for that. And he did have good answers. In the last few weeks of the semester, he was making an effort in his work to reach out to Spanish-speaking people to make sure they felt welcome in his place of business and to take opportunities to practice his Spanish with them, in a really remarkable transformation from the beginning of the course. All right, I have one more reflection question for you, but this is actually one I'm going to leave for you in an ongoing basis. We're not going to take time to answer it right now, but I want you to come to the action stage of your own transformative teaching and chart your own trajectory. What classroom practices do you already have in your toolbox for generating disorienting dilemmas, creating space for reflection, building relationships, and taking action? I don't think you need a new textbook unless you want to get one. That's all. Change is good, but I don't think you need a new textbook. I don't think you need a textbook at all. I don't think you need a specific teaching method. You don't have to go take a course on how to teach this way or that way. What you need is to teach in a way that actually helps students learn language, whatever that way is for you, and to make a little bit of room for students to have disoriented dilemmas, and instead of using the escape hatch to go back to their existing meaning perspective, move them forward into reflection. Create moments in your class where people can think about, what are they learning? How are they learning it? What does it mean for them? Are they having negative feelings? Are they experiencing things outside of class that relate to what we're doing in class? Are you helping students to build relationships with each other? Are you giving them opportunities to learn about each other and about individual people in the communities we're teaching about? And are you encouraging them, giving them a little nudge towards taking action? And I think if you sit down and just map out, what are you already doing that fit into these categories? And how can you maybe just turn up the volume on them a little bit to make even more room for transformation? I think you can incorporate social justice content and know that you're not just sending students right back to their existing meaning perspective, you're actually giving them a path forward to be the sort of transformed, engaged citizens we're all hoping for. And that's it. So what other questions do we have, or what other things should we talk about?
I see a lot of people commenting in the chat that this has been transformative for them. So first of all,
Awesome.
and I myself, I really appreciate how much you're highlighting that this isn't about throwing out what you're doing, but instead bringing it into the other things that you're doing. We do have a question from Anna that I want to make sure to bring in here. She asks if you can talk a little bit about, I think this is a question that is important because it always comes up. Can you address the issue of giving oneself permission to use the L1 or the institutional language with novice learners to facilitate transformative learning, or even possibly at intermediate levels, so that students can have a chance to discuss some of these things, maybe in ways that are beyond the language fluency that they have in the language they're learning?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. I also think it's super personal. So I don't want to give you advice so much as just to tell you what I do. The language class that I studied for this, what we've been talking about here today, she spoke a lot of English in class. There were times when she was like in Spanish mode and times when she was in English mode. And I think for a lot of us, the amount of English that was spoken in that class would be more than we could really do. I like to speak mostly in the target language, like 99% in the target language. And it's very simple language because I want everything that I say I want students to just hear it and be able to make sense of it and never feel overwhelmed or out of control. I want my classroom to really feel like a place where we're communicating easily in the target language all the time. All that to say, I think this is not necessarily tied to your transformative practices. So me, as someone who does all of my classroom activities, basically in Spanish, I find ways to open up room. Maybe once a week for 5 minutes, they do a questionnaire in English. We're not talking about it out loud. They're just doing some reflection. Or maybe there's a discussion board. In addition to all of our target language discussion boards, there's also a discussion board in English where I can say, hey, are you having any strong reactions? Are there any news stories that you're connecting to what we're talking about? Is there anything you want to post here for your classmates? To create a little bit of a social space online where we can unpack some of the experiences we're having. I also do my office hours completely in English, and I do the 15 minutes before and after my class completely in English. And I make that choice. Like I flip to Spanish as soon as class starts and then flip off, but I make the choice to do all the peripheral stuff in English because I want them to tell me what they did over the weekend. I want them to come in a few minutes early and tell me about the great meal they had, or tell me about how hard their chemistry test was. I want to build that camaraderie with them, but I'm really careful not to do that at the expense of my class time, because I think my class time is pretty precious. Not every instructor is going to make those choices, and I have found that some people who make very different choices than me have stunning transformations in their classrooms. So I would say, do what you think is best for your language learners, for you. Know that language learning is a natural process. We're biologically wired to learn language. So you don't have to treat your students with kid gloves and do everything perfect 100% of the time. If you're giving them a language-rich environment, they're going to learn. Transformation also isn't something you have to treat students with kid gloves. If you give them opportunities and they're at a place in their lives where they're going to transform, it's going to happen. So maybe that takes some of the pressure off, feeling like you have to know how much L1 to use.
That's really helpful. I'm going to real quick just insert that we've shared a poll. And so Chila's also sharing a more open-ended survey. And we use the results of these not only for ourselves and for presenters as feedback, but we also use them when we apply for grants for funding to host events like this. So please do take a couple of minutes to do those. They're very important for us. Denise has a question. It actually kind of dovetails with something I was going to ask you about. So maybe if Denise doesn't mind, I'll kind of fold our questions together.
Okay.
And it's a question of how you keep track of transformation. And I think you made it really clear that a lot of this could even happen outside of our site and outside of our ability to recognize it. And I was thinking about that because I work a lot with novice instructors. And I know one of the things that they struggle with a lot is how can we teach the things that we can't control or that we can't account for? So can you just talk a little bit about that? Do you have ways that you try to track that? Denise suggested, for example, journals, diaries, records of responses, or how do you kind of negotiate that fact that a lot of the transformative learning might not be visible to us and might even happen after our classes end?
It's really, really tough because also transformative learning is very personal. So if we require our students to bare their souls to us, I have a feeling like that could backfire. Like if I tell students you have to keep a journal where you talk about every negative feeling you had while you're learning, I mean, I just think that's too much invasion. So as an instructor, I'm not even trying to keep track of transformation, but I still see the glimmers. Like I see one student react one way when we do something early in the semester, and then really start to learn to question themselves and react in different ways as the semester goes on. And so as someone who is always thinking about transformation, I think I'm pretty good at looking around and seeing what's happening. But I would actually encourage teachers not to micromanage learning, just not to micromanage learning, but not to micromanage transformative learning. What I focus on is teaching in a way that seems to be effective for producing learning. But when you shift the focus to controlling the learning, I think you get into the wrong, like a whole set of activities that are really, there's all sorts of power dynamics there that I'm not comfortable with. So no, I don't ask my students to keep journals. And I'll also tell you that in my experience, teachers are not aware of all the ways their students are transforming. This is a previous study, actually, before this one. I interviewed 3 women who were all in a particular Spanish class. And one of them revealed to me that she had had 2 terminated pregnancies during the semester when she was taking Spanish. It was a shocking thing for someone to reveal to me as a researcher. We developed that rapport where she felt like she could tell me. And it was really shocking that we got to that level of intimacy where she could say, well, I got to be honest, one of the reasons why I connected so much with this particular person that we were reading about in an authentic resource was because I terminated 2 pregnancies this semester alone. And it was such an overwhelming semester for me personally that reading this story about someone really struggling in their relationship connected with me. And I was like, holy Moses, there's no way that the teacher knew that that was happening. There's no way that they could have developed a relationship where the student would have felt comfortable telling someone who had authority over her grades and authority over whether she moved on to the second semester, the extent to which she was really struggling with personal and medical situations. So yeah, I would say don't. Don't worry. Make room for it. Notice when you see glimmers of it, but don't worry if you don't have evidence of it.
I think that's really helpful. Honestly, because I think, and sometimes we all feel overwhelmed by all of the things that we're trying to do. So that reminder that it's about making space in your curriculum, in your existing curriculum, and that reminder that you don't have to control it all, that it's about creating that possibility of transformative learning, I think is actually very inspiring and reassuring in some ways.
And isn't it nice to have something that for once you don't have to provide evidence of it? Like, I'm making space for it because it's like growing yeast. If you create the like conditions under which yeast accumulates, it will come. You don't have to micromanage it. You can just trust it's going to happen.
Well, I think I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to leave us all with the metaphor of transformative learning and integrating that into the classroom is like yeast, which is definitely the metaphor for the moment.
For all of us doing sourdough baking in quarantine right now, it's the only metaphor I can think of.
Thank you. Please join me. I know many of you are putting thank yous and expressions of gratitude to Stacey there in the chat, and we'll make sure that she gets those after the talk when she has space to process them. But for now, please join me. You're all not going to be able to unmute yourselves, so you'll have to join me virtually, but I'm going to clap on behalf of us all to thank Stacey for this wonderful presentation and the discussion that she's led.
Thank you. It's really been a lot of fun, and I can't wait to read the chat transcript later and learn from you guys and all the comments that you've been making throughout. And I hope to connect with everyone on social media too.